Hi, I'm Norm Abram. Welcome to the new Yankee Workshop. The last chair that we built was a side chair. Chairs often look simple, but they can be a challenge for the woodworker. Today we're going to build a corner chair, and we found wonderful examples in a collection owned by Historic New England. We'll take you there next and look at what they have, and then come back here and build our own version of the corner chair. Look at this place, a warehouse filled with antiques. Dozens of chairs and sofas and chests, and none of it's for sale.
No. Welcome, Norm, to Historic New England's Conservation and Collection Center. Historic New England's been collecting this material, furniture, decorative art, since 1910, and it's available to students and to collectors and people like you who are interested.
Well, you know, we called you looking for corner chairs. Did you find any?
I found two that I thought you'd be interested in.
Oh, look at this one. Looks like it's mahogany. Has the cabriole leg. That's very elegant. Crossed stretcher. It's got some apron that's actually curved. That's unusual. How about the seat? Does that pop out?
The seat pops out. It's called a slip seat. And originally it would have been covered in a wool or even leather. And oftentimes it hid a chamber pot.
Really? So they would have a chamber pot?
Chamber pot right there.
That's interesting. It has a couple splats. Very simple, though. It's a nice piece. How about that one behind you?
The one behind me is a little later, a little simpler. This one was made about 1800.
And instead of a splat, it has a curved rail with a heart cut out of it. That's interesting. And it seems much lighter. These legs are pretty light. The seat seems to be very thin. What's that about?
I think that's because it was made to fit in a federal interior. Federal interiors were much lighter than their Georgian counterparts.
I think I got a lot of good ideas, and if you don't mind, I'd like to take a couple measurements.
Great.
Well, here's our version of a corner chair. I took inspiration from all the ones that we looked at. I decided to build ours out of cherry. I have these pierced splats, and I like the upholstered seat. Found some nice tapestry fabric for that. I want to get started today with the turn legs. I need 3. I've mounted one of the blanks for the legs in my lathe and made sure that it's balanced. Before we do any turning, let's talk about shop safety. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. Now when turning, I also like to use a full face shield. I've marked out the square portion of the leg, and it ends right here. I'm going to start with a skew chisel and make a cut there, and then using a gouge, I'll round this section. That's just the right depth. Now I'll round it. Now look at the tool rest for a second. The top of the tool rest is about 1/8 of an inch below the center line. It's parallel to the turning and centered on the portion that I'll turn. All right, that's pretty good. For this last portion, I'm going to use my parting tool to clean it up. I don't want to take the chance of hitting this corner with my gouge. Okay, now we're ready to do a little layout. I've made a full-scale drawing of the turning. I'm going to put it right on the piece. There's the shoulder, and I'm going to mark all the critical transitions. Okay, I want to transfer those lines all the way around. Using my calipers, I can set the various diameters of the turning. I hold the caliper in my left hand, the parting tool in my right hand, and I'll get it cut to the exact depth. Now I've switched to a 3/8 inch gouge, and I'm going to work on this section right here, creating a cove. I always start at the high side of the cove and work to the deep part. Now I'm switching to a skew chisel because my gouge won't fit in this corner. So I'll make a cut in, and a couple cuts will complete the bead. Now here's a tip I picked up a few years ago. The way to perfectly size a tenon is to use an open-end wrench. In this case, 3/4 of an inch. Okay, that looks good. 2 more to go. The way that this chair goes together is with mortise and tenon joinery between the rails and the legs, and I've spent quite a bit of time laying them out. This is the back leg. There's a left and right leg, which are mirror images of one another in the layout, and of course, the short front leg. The good news is that all the mortises are the same width and the same depth. The only adjustment that I'll have to make is the distance the mortise is from the corner of the leg. Now I'm beginning to form tenons, and I've set up a stop block because all the tenons are the same length and adjusted it so I'll have a 3/4 inch tenon. These are for the stretchers, the narrow rails, and the big rails. It'll take several cuts to form the tenons on each. Okay, that takes care of the tenons. The next thing I want to work on are the back rails, which receive the splat. I need a mortise that's cut at a 15-degree angle. I'll show you how I do that. I've made a jig that has a top sloped at 15 degrees and clamped one of the rails in place. The slot represents the length of the mortise. I can use the top edge here to guide my fence on the router, and I've put stops at the end and at the beginning of the mortise. And that's what I want. The next thing I want to do is make this profile along the inside edge of the rail we were just working on. It's going to take a couple different router bits. I'm going to start with this 1/2-inch round nose bit, and by making a couple passes and moving the fence, I'll get the lower part of the profile. Now I've switched over to a 3/8 round over bit to complete the profile. Now I'm going to turn my attention to these front rails. I need a rabbet on the inside edge to receive the seat. This is the profile at the top of the rail. Now the rails that I just molded fit into that front leg, so I need to make the profile on the 2 outside corners. Now I'm taking the time to dry fit all the pieces that we've made so far to make sure that the joints are nice and sweet. Clamp them together, and if they don't quite fit correctly, I'll do a little fine tuning. When I'm done with that, we'll be ready to glue it up. With the base of the chair all clamped up, I'm now ready to turn my attention to the splats. So what I did is I took a piece of plywood and I drilled a couple holes so I could slip it over the tenons on the legs. And then I made a piece of plywood so I could check the height to make sure it's absolutely even on each end, and that's good. Now I'll be able to determine the length of my splat. Now here's a piece of plywood that I cut a tenon in, and you can see that the shoulder of the tenon has to be at a 15-degree angle so that it'll fit properly in the mortise that I made earlier. Here's the material for one of the splats. 5/8 inch thick cherry, about 7.5 inches wide. I've laid out the shoulders of that tenon, and you can see that 15-degree bevel. So I've tipped the saw to 15 degrees. I'll come in very carefully, make the shoulder cut, and then nibble away the rest of the material on this side. Then I'll flip it over, come to this side, and repeat the process. On my spacer piece, I've cut the top at 15 degrees. But I didn't form a tenon on top of it. I actually need a tenon just like the one on the bottom, which will go into the crest rail and the underside of the arm. Here I have a pattern for the splat that I made on poster board, and I've laid it all out on one of the pieces. Now I want to cut both pieces at the same time, so I've applied some double stick tape to one of the pieces. I put one on top of the other, align my witness mark there, and stick them together. Now before I can head over to the scroll saw where I'll do the cutting, I want to drill holes on these interior cuts so I can feed the blade through. The best tool for this job is the scroll saw. It has a very fine blade, and the action is much like a sewing machine, up and down at a relatively high speed, in this case 1400 RPMs. If you look at the inside of the cut, you can see how smooth it is, so it'll require very little sanding. One of the things I like about this model is that it's relatively quiet. A lot of these can be really noisy. Well, this seems to be going reasonably well. But I think before I leave tonight, I'll complete cutting out this splat, or this pair of splats, I should say, and we will easily finish this chair tomorrow. Oh, good morning. Last night I did complete cutting the splats and sanding them. I also took the time to put the first coat of stain on our prototype chair. And today we want to work on these arms and this crest rail. Now if I spin it around, you can see that the crest rail tips back at 10 degrees. And if I place it down on the floor, I can show you the intersection between the arm and the crest rail. There's a mortise in the crest rail, a tenon on the arm. When I built the prototype, I made this template, which is the back bottom edge of the crest rail, and I marked the intersection with the arms. I can use this template to lay out the next one, which is a blank of cherry glued up. I've marked the curve and the intersection with the arms. I want to clip these off first. Cut. Here's how I make that slope in the crest rail. I tilt my bandsaw table to 10 degrees. This is the bottom of the crest rail, so I've put some marks showing how it pitches back at the top. And if I line that mark up with the saw blade, you can see that it's perfect. So I'm ready to cut. After sanding the outside of the crest rail, the next thing I want to do is cut the mortise right here where the arm is going to fit into it. It's a difficult piece to hold, but if I use the scrap from the previous cutout and some clamps, I can secure it in place, and that will allow me to use my router with the guide fence and a 3/8 inch bit to make that mortise. And that's the inside curve of our crest rail. The crest rail gets centered right on this back post. So before I go any further, I'm going to drill that hole. Now here I'm laying out a decorative cut at each end of the crest rail. I'll cut it at my bandsaw. It's a bit of freehand, although I'll leave the table tilted to 10 degrees. And then I'll clean it up with the drum sander. I'm easing the back edge of that crest rail with a 1/2 inch radius. shape the front edge of the crest rail, I'm using a 1 1/4 inch router bit. If I didn't have that, I could shape it by hand. Now for the arms. Here's a pattern that I made, and you can see that I just butt it right up against that crest rail. It doesn't have the tenon included. So what I did is I took a piece of 1 inch stock, laid out the shape of the arm, and then added 3/4 of an inch to allow for material to form the tenon. Now for the shoulders on that tenon. I've taken my miter gauge and adjusted it so the cut is parallel to my stop, and I'll run one side through. Now flip it over, readjust the miter gauge so it's tight to the stop, and do the other side. Let's take a look at how this arm is going to intersect with the crest rail. Because the crest rail is tipped, I can't cut the entire arm at 90 degrees. I'll cut this back side at 90 and I'll sand it at the bevel. On the inside, I'll come in at 10 degrees to here and then transition to 90 the rest of the way around. Now, using a small round over bit, I've just run an edge around the top of the arm, and I'll clean up this corner with a chisel to make it nice and square so it doesn't appear routed. For the last several minutes, I've been perfecting the tenons on the ends of the arms that fit into these mortises. I've applied the glue to both sides. I'll slip them in place. I put a little bit of tape on the outer edge so I won't glue my band clamp in place. I have this spacer which goes between the front arms, a little wedge, and bring our band clamp around it, tighten it all up, set it aside to dry. This portion of the front leg needs to be removed so the seat will fit. Now for some corner blocks, which will provide some strength to the chair and support for the seat. A little glue and screws. Well, now it's time to build another one of these. The seat cushion starts out as a piece of 3/4 inch plywood. I've cut a hole out in the center. The first piece of material is this woven polypropylene, which I'll stretch tightly and staple. Here's a piece of upholsterer's foam. It's 1.5 inches thick, cut to the same size as the plywood. And what I want to do is roll that edge down and staple it in place. Okay, that takes care of the foam. Next is some cotton batting. I'll drape it over and then just tear it off even with the bottom of the frame. And here's our fabric. I'm going to position it on the piece where I want it, and then I'll flip it over and staple it to the underside. This black polyester fabric covers the bottom of the seat. Well, let's see how we did. Should be snug, which it is. That fits pretty well. Now we can go back to the woodworking. Now that the crest rail and arm assembly is dry, I can mark the location of the holes for the posts. That's good. Now, using this sample piece that I had for the splat, I'm going to drop it into the mortise, butt it up tight to the bottom of the armrest and crest rail, and lay out the location for the mortise I need to receive the top of the splat. You'll note that I've split the long tenon at the top of the slat into two smaller tenons. I don't want to have a tenon run through this mortise and tenon joint. I've laid out the location of the mortises I want, and because this splat tips at 15 degrees, I made another jig to cut the mortise. It slopes at 15 degrees. I use the same router and guide fence. The guide fence runs against this edge. I have a stop here at the forward end and another one back here. Okay, let's take it apart and see how we did. That's perfect. After a dry fit, I'm now ready for the final glue up. When I get this all in position, I'll put some clamps on it, and we'll go back to the finishing room and work on the first chair that we made. Now, cherry is one of those woods that has a lot of variation from one piece to another. And once the piece of furniture is built, the trick is to blend all those varying tones. Now, we found that by starting with a light brown stain, applying that first, letting it dry, then putting on a coat of shellac, followed by some glaze or gel stain, that seems to do a good job. Well, after that stain dried last night, we applied a coat of shellac. And then when that was dry, knocked it down with some steel wool. Now I'm applying a brown mahogany gel stain. Put it on fairly liberally, and then wipe it off with a rag. I've already done it to the splat, and you can see how it darkens the wood slightly, and it will blend the various tones of the cherry. Now, when this is all done, we'll put on several coats of polyurethane. Well, here it is, with several coats of polyurethane over the gel stain, ready for use. Now, there's no doubt about it, chairs are a challenge, but if you're up for it, it's well worth the effort.
From 11 p.m. on